Today, you can walk into a hospital, get an epidural, and have a team of trained surgeons standing by, an entire system built around making sure mother and baby both walk out of that room. Women in the ancient world had none of that. What they had was each other, an enormous stockpile of herbs, prayers tossed up to gods who didn't always answer, and a level of nerve that's honestly hard to wrap your head around. And here's the strange part. For thousands of years, that was enough, most of the time. So how exactly did they manage it? Before we dig in, let's get one thing straight. Giving birth in the ancient world wasn't just uncomfortable or painful. It was a genuine gamble with your life. We're talking about a real, meaningful chance that you wouldn't walk out of that room at all. Ancient Greek grave markers, carved stone steles, show young women sitting down, saying their final goodbyes to husbands and mothers while holding their babies. Archaeologists recognize exactly what that scene means. Those women didn't survive the birth. There are so many of these carvings that historians can actually trace maternal death rates just by studying cemetery art. In ancient Rome, roughly 1 to 2% of all births ended with the mother's death. That number sounds small on its own, but remember, women were expected to bear 4, 5, 6 children or more over a lifetime, so the odds stacked up fast. And the news for infants was even grimmer. Archaeological findings suggest that across many ancient societies, somewhere between 30 and 50% of children never made it to age 5. Some died within the first days. Some never made it out of the birth itself. None of this was rare. It was simply the backdrop of everyday life. Birth and death sharing the same room, the same night. So when we look at how women in the ancient world gave birth, we have to recognize they were doing something genuinely brave every time. Not in a poetic sense. Actually brave. The kind of bravery where you know this might be the thing that kills you, and you go through with it anyway. Now, let's get into the actual details. Across nearly every ancient civilization, on every continent, in every culture, one pattern held steady. Birth belonged to women. Men were not present, not husbands, not fathers, not male physicians, unless the situation had become dire and death was already on the table. Even then, it was treated as an absolute last resort. The person in charge of everything was the midwife. The word itself, in Old English, literally translates to with woman, which describes her role perfectly. She was the one who stayed by your side through the entire ordeal, the one who actually knew what she was doing. Midwifery ranks among humanity's oldest professions, with evidence stretching back at least 40,000 years to the Paleolithic period. Sit with that for a second. This predates agriculture, writing, cities, basically everything we'd associate with civilized society. Women were already there, helping other women through labor. Those early midwives weren't trained from books. They learned through observation. They watched how animals gave birth, how mammals positioned their bodies, how they handled pain, what instincts kicked in, and they applied that knowledge to human deliveries. That information traveled from mother to daughter, from experienced women to their apprentices, across countless generations. By the time you reach Egypt, Greece, and Rome, the midwife had earned a solid, respected place in society. Not necessarily rich, often a working woman, but indispensable. In Rome, a skilled midwife was treated as priceless. Soranus of Ephesus, a physician and one of our richest sources on ancient gynecology, wrote a complete manual on the subject in the 2nd century CE, and in it he lays out the qualities of an ideal midwife. She needed to stay calm under pressure. She needed sharp instincts, small hands, and that mattered a lot, as we'll get into. She needed real education, not just hands-on experience. She needed knowledge of herbs and remedies. Superstition was a disqualifier. So was fearfulness. Soranus also recommends she be sober, which tells you that this wasn't a given for everyone in the profession. In most ancient societies, A woman didn't necessarily give birth in her own bedroom, even though hospitals obviously weren't an option. In Greece and Rome, there was often a dedicated room set aside for the occasion, sometimes called the cubiculum, specially arranged for labor. The space would be kept warm, softly lit, and packed with the women providing support relatives, close friends, the midwife, and often her helpers. In Egypt, archaeologists have uncovered birth houses, small buildings attached to temples, their walls decorated with carvings depicting the divine births of gods. Whether everyday Egyptian women actually used comparable structures is still debated among scholars, but the symbolism speaks for itself. Childbirth was treated as sacred enough to merit its own physical space. In ancient China, the mother was kept in a designated room for roughly a month, both before and after delivery, a custom that still echoes in Chinese postpartum traditions today. The goal was to keep her warm, shielded from drafts, and separated from anything that might invite misfortune. Across these cultures, there was also serious attention paid to spiritually protecting the birth space. The room would be readied with specific prayers, rituals, charms, and offerings. In Egypt, the goddess Taweret, a striking figure combining a hippo's body, a crocodile's tail, and a lion's limbs, served as the guardian of pregnant women and childbirth. Statues of her stood in birth rooms, amulets bearing her image were worn, and she was called upon throughout labor. Honestly, if a hippo-crocodile lion hybrid was keeping watch over you, that might genuinely be reassuring. At least nothing else in the room could be scarier looking. In Rome and Greece, women appealed to Juno Lucina, whose name roughly translates to "she who brings to light," meaning she helps usher children into the world. Diana Artemis and Hera were also invoked. Every ancient culture had its own divine protectors of birth, and people called on them with complete sincerity and urgency. Here's where things get genuinely fascinating and where modern practice actually looks a little odd by comparison. We've grown accustomed to the image of a woman lying flat on her back to deliver. Hospital bed, legs raised, the standard arrangement. But that position is actually a fairly recent development, gaining popularity in Europe around the 17th century, partly because it made things easier for attending doctors to watch and step in. Ancient women didn't deliver that way at all. They gave birth upright, almost without exception, standing, squatting, kneeling, or sitting, all positions that let gravity, that force pulling everything downward, help move the baby along, which, when you actually think it through, makes complete sense. The most widespread position across Egypt, Greece, Rome, the Near East, and China was squatting, typically over a purpose-built birthing stool or birthing brick. The stool had a U-shaped or crescent opening in the center, allowing the midwife to reach in from below. The mother would sit on it with her back supported by an assistant, while the midwife knelt or crouched in front, ready to help. In Egypt, archaeologists have actually recovered birthing bricks, solid bricks shaped from Nile clay that women squatted over during labor. A remarkable find in 2001 at the Abydos site turned up a painted birthing brick from around 1750 BCE, illustrated with a woman cradling her newborn, surrounded by protective imagery. These bricks weren't merely functional. They doubled as ceremonial objects, sacred pieces of furniture. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the earliest known medical texts in existence, dated to roughly 1550 BCE in Egypt, includes specific guidance for assisting deliveries. It mixes incantations, herbal preparations, and physical techniques. Some of it holds up as genuinely practical advice. Some of it calls on the goddess Isis, frequently in the very same breath. Now let's address the obvious. The very painful, very real, completely unmedicated experience of contractions. Epidurals weren't a thing. Anesthesia wasn't a thing. The very idea of a pain-free delivery as a medical objective simply didn't exist yet. What did exist was an impressive range of herbal remedies that midwives and healers relied on to dull pain, speed up labor, calm nerves, and minimize complications. In Egypt, women were given preparations that included opium poppy. Yes, genuinely. Combined with juniper berries, believed to intensify contractions. Other mixtures involved oils, fats, and plant extracts, either rubbed on or consumed as drinks. In Greece and Rome, a wide range of plants came into play. Pennyroyal, wormwood, and rue were known to trigger contractions. Saffron had its own medicinal uses, and plain old wine was commonly given to laboring women as a mild sedative and pain reliever. Not enough to make her unconscious, just enough to soften the edges. There's truth in wine, apparently, and a bit of help in labor too. Soranus advised midwives to prepare warm compresses and oils for massage, along with specific herbal blends meant to relax the birth canal and ease the baby's path. He gave detailed instructions for rubbing olive oil onto the mother's abdomen and perineum, a technique modern studies have actually confirmed offers real benefit. Some cultures leaned on psychological methods for managing pain too, steady reassurance from the women present, chanting, music, rhythmic breathing. Nothing like the structured techniques taught in modern birthing classes, but the organic kind that emerges when you're surrounded by women breathing alongside you, singing with you, telling you it's all going to be fine. The communal nature of ancient childbirth is something that really can't be overstated. A woman was never left alone. She'd be surrounded by every available female relative and friend, holding her up both physically and emotionally. They murmured encouragement in her ear. They shared stories of other births that turned out fine. They reminded her of her own resilience. There's something powerful about that. A room packed with women, sharing one experience, the collective female knowledge that modern medicine is only just starting to rediscover through doulas and group prenatal care. Of course, not every birth went smoothly, and the ancient world had to handle complications that today would simply call for a C-section, forceps, or other surgical equipment, none of which existed in anything close to their modern form. The most dreaded scenario was a baby positioned wrong. A breech baby, coming bottom, first instead of head first, could spell death for both mother and child. Soranus outlined a method for manually repositioning a fetus inside the womb, known as version, which demanded precisely the qualities he listed for an ideal midwife: small hands and a serious amount of courage. It wasn't gentle, but it worked often enough that midwives skilled in the technique were actively sought out. Another dreaded scenario was obstructed labor, when the baby simply couldn't make it through the birth canal. Without surgical options, this could drag on for hours, sometimes days. Mothers died. Babies died. In the worst cases, ancient physicians described a brutal but necessary procedure. If the baby had already died inside the womb and couldn't be delivered intact, it had to be removed in pieces to save the mother's life. Reading these old texts isn't easy. They're written with clinical precision, and they're sobering. These were people doing everything they could with the tools available to them: steady hands and very sharp instruments. A cesarean section, in the way we understand it today, wasn't performed on living women in antiquity with the goal of saving both mother and child. The procedure existed, but in an entirely different context. Roman law actually mandated that an infant be removed from a mother's body after her death, before burial, in an attempt to save the child. Various myths and religious stories reference figures delivered by Caesarean, the Chinese hero De Yu, and several Roman and Greek semi-divine characters. But as a routine medical practice on living mothers, that wouldn't arrive for many centuries. Of all the ancient civilizations, Egypt stands out as arguably the most advanced when it comes to organized women's medicine. Egypt had medical schools connected to temples, some of which trained women: female healers, female physicians, female midwives, all documented in surviving Egyptian records. Some female healers carried the title Lady of Life. Their grasp of anatomy, their herbal knowledge, their record-keeping, all remarkably advanced for the period. The Kauhan Papyrus, dating back to roughly 1825 BCE, stands as the oldest known gynecological text in human history. It addresses pregnancy testing, fertility, contraception, and labor complications. One pregnancy test involved placing a clove of garlic or an onion near a woman's cervix overnight. If her breath smelled of it by morning, she was considered not pregnant. Does this actually work? No. Is it one of the more unforgettable pieces of medical advice ever written down? Without question. Egyptian women also had access to surprisingly functional contraceptive methods, including a pessary made from crocodile dung, honey, and natron. Modern chemical analysis has shown that crocodile dung is alkaline, meaning it could realistically act as a spermicide. Let that sink in fully. Ancient Egyptian women had access to crocodile dung spermicide. In ancient China, the tradition of Zuo Uzi, sitting the month, surrounded childbirth with an elaborate system of postpartum recovery. The belief was that giving birth drained a mother's vital energy, or Qi, and that a full month of rest, particular foods, warmth, and seclusion was essential to restore her strength. During labor itself, upright positions were standard practice. Chinese medical writings from the Han Dynasty onward document the use of herbal remedies to encourage contractions, ease pain, and control bleeding. The structured nature of Chinese medicine meant these techniques were written down, studied, and refined over generations in ways that matched anything happening in the West. Midwives in China started out as informal community figures, women with their own birth experience who assisted others. Over time, particularly during the Song Dynasty, the role gained more formal recognition and specialization. Knowledge typically stayed within families or tight-knit communities, and a lot of what feels traditional today traces back thousands of years. The delivery itself was only the start. Across nearly every ancient culture, what followed birth carried just as much ritual weight as the birth itself. In Rome, the newborn was laid on the ground, and the father, who had been waiting outside the entire time, almost certainly anxious, was brought in. He would inspect the child, and if he picked it up, that was his way of formally accepting it into the family. If he didn't, that revealed a much darker side of ancient society. Infants judged too frail, too small, disabled, or simply unwanted because of poverty or the wrong gender in a male, favoring culture were sometimes left outside to die, a practice known as exposure. This was both legal and not uncommon, and it was a harsh reality that midwives, mothers, and families had to confront. In Egypt, the moments right after birth were filled with their own precise rituals. Cutting the umbilical cord according to set methods, wrapping the infant in particular cloth, reciting specific prayers. Both Taweret and Bes, a dwarf deity who guarded households and children, depicted with a deliberately fierce expression meant to ward off evil spirits, were honored at this stage. In many ancient societies, the placenta carried enormous symbolic weight. In Egypt, the pharaoh's placenta was assigned its own standard and its own hieroglyph, carried in royal processions almost as a second self. The Maori of New Zealand buried the placenta directly in the ground. The Maori word for land and the word for placenta are the same, whenua. The link between birth and earth, between body and soil, wasn't symbolic at all. It was literal. What stands out, reading through all of this, is that ancient women weren't helpless. They weren't uninformed. They weren't simply enduring something they didn't understand. They carried thousands of years of accumulated knowledge handed down from woman to woman, community to community. They understood anatomy, maybe not in our modern vocabulary, but functionally. They understood herbal remedies. They understood why warmth mattered, why position mattered, why emotional support mattered. They were practicing science before the word existed. They were practicing medicine before anyone needed a license to do it. Yes, their mortality rates were far higher. Yes, their toolkit was far smaller. Yes, some outcomes simply couldn't be fixed with what they had. But the essence of what they were doing, guiding a woman through one of the most demanding physical experiences a body can undergo, using every available resource with skilled hands and deep expertise, isn't all that different from what a capable midwife does today. Modern obstetrics didn't spring up out of nowhere. It was built on a foundation of ancient knowledge, ancient practice, and ancient women who paid close attention, remembered what worked, and passed it on. The midwives of Egypt, Rome, and China are the distant ancestors of everyone working in birth care today. And every woman who has ever given birth, in any century, in any country, under any circumstances, joins a lineage stretching back 40,000 years. That's not a small thing. That's everything. We come back around to where we started. A woman in a room surrounded by other women, doing the oldest thing a human body can do. The tools have changed. Survival rates have climbed dramatically, magnificently, thanks to science, medicine, and decades of relentless work. A woman giving birth in a modern hospital today has access to interventions that would have looked like pure sorcery to Cyrannus of Ephesus. The death rates that once defined childbirth have dropped to near zero across much of the world. And yet some things remain exactly the same. The fear, the pain, the hope, a room full of people who love you, the instant a new life arrives and everything goes loud, then somehow quiet. Ancient women knew that exact moment. They lived for it. They risked everything for it. They squatted on clay bricks, called out to Hippo, shaped goddesses, drank wine steeped with herbs, surrounded by every woman who loved them, praying to whichever deity might be listening. And honestly, most of the time, it worked. So if your mother's still around, maybe send her a text today, just saying,